Well, I suppose because I'm a specialist in decision-making uncertainty, I should say that as technical change speeds up, uncertainty also speeds up, escalates. We need time to both consider and to tentatively experiment and find out what the consequences of our new technologies are. When new technologies come at an increasing rate, the time devoted to that is, in a sense, going to be less, and the probability of the unknown being bad at some stage starts to increase for any given period of time that you're crowding with faster and faster technical change. Thalidomide on reflection wasn't a good idea. Generous use of antibiotics has its problems. Switching nationally, in fact internationally, from one form of wheat to another seem to have problems too, as regards gluten-free intolerance suddenly escalating. Immunizations may have a downturn. Fluoride in the water may not be such a good idea after all. Face masks used for COVID might result in a lack of clearing out of bacteria and so on from in front of the mouth and nose. Poor ventilation, if you like. Painkillers can become addictive. Asbestos in buildings turned out to be not so good. You name it. And of course some societies are not are quite deliberately not sensitive to the problems of new applications because of vested interests somewhere, either politically or economically, in its organisation and systems, and so the costs can be higher. It's a more general one we touched on, which is that if we really reduce dramatically, as we have, the time that the individual is just waiting, sitting, looking, sitting on public transport and waiting at the bus stop and not necessarily having the next order and business to deal with, because you won't know about it until the person phones you up on your landline when you're at home, or even before that visits you and asks if you can do something. And this ability not to have to move around removes enormous numbers of contacts that you would otherwise have simply in your transportation method of moving yourself from one place to another. Sitting on the train, you meet commuters. Sitting in your car, you don't. Things like that can perhaps dramatically change your numbers of human contact and your time for thought and reflection and, if you like, meditation. I don't mean some formal meditation, but thinking about things, travelling, looking at other people, noticing surroundings. That's missing if you can spend an increasingly amount of your time shut in your room with the curtains drawn and hunched over your computer. There are obviously health and posture hazards and all sorts of things to do with sight and inertia of the body, driving around in your car is not as healthy as walking to the bus and walking to the railway station and so on. And we know these things, don't we? We're not clear cumulatively, long run, how it's going to affect. It's a gradual change. We don't notice that there aren't crowds of birds in the morning singing. We don't notice that you don't occasionally walk along and there's just a whole cloud of butterflies around a particular bush. You don't notice the variety of birds and butterflies and wildlife vanishing. You don't notice the gradual lack of trees as the older ones come down and perhaps the small ones aren't planted or don't survive, or there's just no place for them. Nobody, the place becomes more urban and the urban area spreads more and the visual environment starts to change from green to whatever the paints are, or lack of paints, or concrete, or tarmac instead of grass and so on. That amount of environment starts to increase and we don't know the effects. But especially the technology of communications becomes so fluid and efficient now that in your workday becomes filled with, if you like, orders and activity in the next job far more efficiently than the gaps that used to be there. So we become very much more active and in a way perhaps less thoughtful. We're always preoccupied with the activity, not the reflection upon things generally. I mean, quite simply, life's become too crowded, doesn't it? Perhaps you don't sit on the train anymore, and you don't sit on the underground, because you don't need to travel to work. And you say, well, that's wonderful, you're at home. Yeah, but not if at home is now filled with continual work. You're still spending, for argument's sake, 7 to 10 hours a day, basically perhaps on a computer. And but you're not meeting anybody. You can exchange information rather than fellowship with people at ease in the way that you did naturally before, when you were in the same room or passing in the street or in the same transport together. So perhaps people become less and less interactive with other people, more and more interactive as regards information flow and solutions, less and less interactive as regards chat and knowing. And it's reckoned that a great deal of communication face to face is not actually verbal. I mean, people have put figures to this, not very reliable, saying 80% or something, but that a great deal of the information we're reading interpersonally is from the personal contact, which is probably, is definitely screened out when it comes to something like texting or phoning, but is still screened out to some extent, even if you're in a sort of video chat with. It doesn't have the same fullness one to the other and fullness of information flow, non-verbal. Depends where the camera is, and don't get me wrong, it's ingenious, and it's very useful where you can't meet. It was obviously came into its own when we had lockdowns and so on because of pandemic, COVID. Yeah, but board meetings run on Zoom were nothing like as inviting as a board meeting person to person. It might be if, board meetings are very strained and you don't like being there and not being person to person, perhaps you can screen out much better what you don't want to be affected by. So it's possible, again, that the Zoom type meeting has its place, I think Zoom is a product name, isn't it? Whatever you call that sort of meeting. There's a tension here between life is change, purposed, of course, for the better, sometimes not achieving that, especially for some groups of people, some individuals and so on. But purpose to be for the better in some respect by the person causing or bringing about the change. Some changes just happen to you, of course, because other people are initiating them, and that may or may not be good for you. And it still presents uncertainties. You're not sure how you're going to handle the change. No change at all is not living. It's death in the ultimate zero change, zero movement, zero thinking. It's death. So that's not good either. There has to be an optimality in between, and there might be several peaks according to the intensity of the change, amount of change. Not to mention the individuality of each change. Each change brings its own uncertainties, and each set of uncertainties is unique in some respect, pertinent to the unique situation in which it's taking place. Decision making in uncertainty from a godly point of view is something to do with courage and trust come faith, and something to do with discriminating between changes that are in keeping with principles that you've found to be a blessing, compared to those that are not a blessing and not consistent with principles that you found to be valuable guidelines as to what to do and what not to do. So we're suspicious of decisions that, well, the world's suspicious of decisions that increase risk unnecessarily, and we're, as godly people, we're concerned with discriminating against risks that seem inconsistent with the value set that we hold. To some extent, everybody's like that. It's just that we might be a bit more focused on following a particular value set that is perhaps more restrictive, more defined than the average person. Now, if you go to the review of this recording, the next recording, that's next one is C, then make some more completeness. Thank you, Dad.